There is a law in this country that's over 160 years old that gives ordinary private citizens the legal right to sue corporations for defrauding the government. No special credentials required, no government job, just a regular person who saw something that wasn't right. And if they win, or if the government settles, that private citizen collects up to 30% of everything recovered. We're talking cases where the payout has reached $266 million to a single person for doing what any decent human being would do, telling the truth about what they saw. This law is called the False Claims Act. Most people have never heard of it. And I argue that's one of the most significant gaps in public knowledge in America, because this law might be the single most powerful tool available to any ordinary citizen who wants to hold a corporation accountable and get paid for doing it. Before we go any further, nothing here is legal advice, and this channel is for educational purposes only. False Claims Act cases are legally complex. If you think you have a case, the right move is to speak with a whistleblower attorney, many of whom take these cases on contingency, meaning you don't pay unless you win. More on that later. For now, let's start at the beginning. Here's something most people don't know. The most powerful whistleblower law in the United States was written by Abraham Lincoln. The reason he wrote it will tell you everything about why it still matters today. Because in 1862, the Union Army was in crisis. And not just from the Confederate forces, but internally by their own government suppliers. Congressional investigations had documented a pattern that was almost unbelievable in its brazenness. Contractors delivering boxes of sawdust instead of rifles, selling the same cavalry horses to the army multiple times, shipping uniforms sewn from compressed rags that literally fell apart in the rain, and soldiers eating rotten food so badly that they ended up dying more to that than enemy gunfire. One profiteer even left a very interesting quote, saying, "You can sell anything to the government at almost any price if you have the guts to ask." Lincoln was absolutely furious. The federal government of 1863 had no investigative infrastructure to pursue thousands of individual contractors. So Lincoln did something kind of brilliant. He turned the public into his investigators. On March 2nd, 1863, Lincoln signed the False Claims Act into law. The concept was simple and radical at the same time. If a private citizen had knowledge of fraud against the government, they could file a lawsuit on the government's behalf, and if the fraud was proven, they kept a share of what was recovered. Lincoln called on citizens to act, in his own words, against those who would feast and fatten on the misfortunes of the nation. Under the original law, the reward was 50% of everything recovered. 50. The government wanted people motivated, and it worked. Congress almost killed this law in 1943, and for 4 decades after that, it was essentially useless. Here's the story of how it came back and why the version you can use today is actually the most powerful version in history. In 1943, Congress gutted the False Claims Act, slashing the citizens' share of recovery, raising barriers to filing, and generally making the law so weak that almost nobody used it. The stated reason was they were worried about parasitic lawsuits by people who copied fraud allegations from existing criminal indictments without any real knowledge. The real effect, however, corporations that were defrauding the government had almost nothing to fear from private citizens, and by the 1980s, the problem had become catastrophic. Defense contractors were overbilling the Pentagon by billions of dollars. Congressional investigators found contractors billing the government for country club memberships, dog kennel fees, and flower arrangements as legitimate defense expenses. The fraud was enormous, brazen, and largely unpunished. So, in 1986, Congress passed the False Claims Act amendments, overhauling the law completely. They raised the citizens' reward to 15 to 30% of recovery, restored the ability of private citizens to file on their own, added strong retaliation protections so employers couldn't simply fire whistleblowers, and made penalties much steeper for violators. The law that Lincoln signed in 1863 finally had real teeth again. Since those 1986 amendments, the law has recovered more than $75 billion in fraudulently obtained government funds. More than $8 billion of that has gone directly to the private citizens who blew the whistle. So how does this actually work in practice? If you're sitting in a job right now and you suspect your employer is defrauding the government, how do you go from, "I think something is wrong," to, "I filed a federal lawsuit and the government is investigating"? Here's the step-by-step. Step 1, document everything. Before you say a word to anyone, start quietly collecting evidence. Emails, billing records, invoices, anything that shows the fraudulent conduct. Keep copies somewhere safe, outside company systems if possible. Your own records are the foundation of any future case. Step 2. Find a whistleblower attorney. This is a non-negotiable. Under the False Claims Act, you're required to have legal representation to file a qui tam lawsuit. But here's the part that surprises most people. The overwhelming majority of whistleblower attorneys take these cases on a pure contingency basis, meaning you pay them nothing unless the case succeeds. Their fee comes out of the whistleblower reward, not out of your pocket. You do not need to be able to afford a lawyer to do this. Third step is the lawsuit is filed under a seal. This means it's kept completely secret, filed in federal court, served on the government, and then placed under a confidentiality order. The company you're suing has no idea it's happening. This is intentional. It protects you from retaliation while the government investigates. Step 4. The government investigates and decides whether to intervene. This can take months or years. The Department of Justice reviews your evidence and decides whether to formally join the case. If they intervene, the government takes the lead on prosecution, which is a very good sign. If they decline to intervene, you and your attorney can still pursue the case on your own, and the reward percentage increases to 30%. And the fifth step is settlement or judgment. The vast majority of False Claims Act cases, over 90%, settle before trial. The government or you reach a negotiated agreement with the defendant. Once the settlement is final, your share is calculated and paid. That's the entire process. Everything I just described might still sound a bit abstract. So let me tell you about some real people, ordinary employees in ordinary jobs who use this law and what happened to them. Robert McCaslin was a hospital employee, not a doctor, not a lawyer, just someone who worked in the hospital administration in Houston. He noticed that his employer, Harris County Hospital, was billing Medicare and Medicaid for patients whose treatment wasn't covered by those programs. He filed a quit-em lawsuit. The hospital paid $15 million to settle. Robert's share was $3 million. For doing what his conscience told him was right. Robert Baker was a revenue manager at a large hospital chain called Community Health System. He discovered the company was running a scheme to inflate Medicaid payments at its New Mexico hospitals. He filed under the False Claims Act, and the company ultimately paid $75 million to settle. Not just Baker's case, but his case was the one that opened the door. And then there's the largest single whistleblower reward in False Claims Act history. In 2022, a realtor, the legal term for the person who files, received a $266 million payment after bringing a case against the pharmaceutical company Biogen. $266 million to a single person because they had inside knowledge of fraud, they knew the law existed, and they had the courage to use it. These aren't exceptional people. They're people who worked in healthcare, in finance, in procurement, who noticed something wrong and knew what to do about it. The law is designed to work for them. It's designed to work for you. One of the most common questions people have is, does my situation actually qualify? What kind of fraud does the False Claims Act actually cover? And here's what you need to know. The key requirement is that fraud involves federal government money. That means any program funded by the federal government. Medicare, Medicaid, federal contracts, Defense Department procurement, and federally backed student loans, federal grants to universities and research institutions, and so much more. The most common category by far is healthcare fraud. This includes billing Medicare or Medicaid for services that were never actually provided, billing for a more expensive procedure than was actually performed, that's called upcoding, paying illegal kickbacks to doctors for patient referrals, and prescribing drugs for uses the FDA hasn't approved in order to collect higher reimbursements. If you work in healthcare, as a nurse, as a biller, a coder, an administrator, or even a doctor, and you've seen any of these things happen, you have potentially qualifying information. Beyond healthcare, there is defense contractor fraud, like overcharging for military equipment or services and substituting inferior materials. Education fraud can include misrepresenting the data to maintain federal accreditation or loan eligibility. And there's research grant fraud, misusing federally funded research money, housing and mortgage fraud involving federal programs, and even reverse false claims, where a company fraudulently avoids paying money they owe the government, like custom duties or taxes. The coverage is broader than most people realize. There is one thing that's required. You need original information, knowledge that isn't already publicly known or already the subject of a pending lawsuit. You need to be the source. If a case is already filed in public, you can't file the same case and collect. And I want to be honest with you about one thing, because this channel is about giving you accurate information, not just the inspiring parts. Whistleblowing is not without risk. The False Claims Act has strong retaliation protections built in. Your employer legally cannot fire you, demote you, harass you, or discriminate against you because of a qui tam filing. And if they do, the law entitles you to reinstatement, back pay, and damages. But those protections are only as good as your willingness to enforce them. which means more legal action. In practice, some whistleblowers do face retaliation. Cases can take years. The sealed period is stressful because you're living with a secret that could affect your career and your family. And if the government declines to intervene and you proceed alone, success is significantly harder. None of this means you shouldn't act, however. It means you should go in with eyes open, with legal counsel, and with a realistic understanding of the process. The law is on your side, but that doesn't mean it's easy. What it does mean, however, is that if you have a real knowledge of real fraud, the legal system has given you a real path forward. That's genuinely extraordinary. And in 1863, Abraham Lincoln faced a government being looted by war profiteers while soldiers died. His solution wasn't just created to prosecute the fraudsters. It was an arm every ordinary citizen with legal power to become an instrument of justice and get paid for it. That idea has survived the Civil War, the 2 World Wars, political attacks in Congress, and 160 years of corporate lobbying. It's still there, it still works, and most people have never heard of it. The next time you hear someone say that one person can't make a difference against a corporation, remember Robert McCaslin. Remember Robert Baker. Remember the realtor who walked away with $266 million. They weren't lawyers. They weren't activists. They were employees who knew something, found the right tool, and used it. If you found this valuable, share it with one person. Someone who works in healthcare, government contracting, or any industry that touches federal money. They deserve to know this law exists. Subscribe for a new case every week and drop a comment. Did you know the False Claims Act existed before today? I genuinely want to know.